مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الكل يعرف أن لدينا انتخابات كبيرة في نوفمبر. دونالد ترامب ضد جو بايدن من أجل فرصة لتولي قيادة العالم الحر. ولكن في واقع لدينا آلاف الانتخابات، لا انتخابات واحدة. بالإضافة إلى اختيار الرئيس، سنختار كل أعضاء مجلس النواب وثلث أعضاء مجلس الشيوخ و11 حاكما و86 من بين 99 مجلسا تشريعيا في مختلف أنحاء البلد. علاوة على ذلك فإن 29 من أكبر 100 مدينة في أمريكا ستختار أمدها، من بولتيمور المطلة على المحيط الأطلنطي وحتى سان دييغو المطلة على المحيط الهادي. معظم الناس حول العالم سيركزون على الحملة الرئاسية، ولكن نتيجة كل الانتخابات الأخرى ستكون لها آثار كبيرة على السياسة في أمريكا لأعوام كثيرة مقبلة. هل سيكون المستقبل ملكاً للديمقراطيين؟ هل سيكون المستقبل ملكاً للجمهوريين؟ لمناقشة كل الانتخابات الأخرى في أمريكا في نوفمبر، يسرني أن أرحب بالخبيرين السياسيين المطلعين توم روغان وجيسيكا تايلور. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, we have a big election in November, but actually we have more than one election. We have thousands of elections, from the federal government down to towns and cities and local communities across the country. Some of those elections really matter. They will determine the fate and the balance of power here in our nation's capital and determine the balance of power in the future of the Democratic and Republican parties across the country. And to tell us more about all those other elections, I'm delighted to welcome Tom Rogan and Jessica Taylor. Thank you very much for joining us today. So, Jessica, tell us just in a nutshell, what are the other big elections that are happening in America on November 3rd?
Well, I think the Senate is probably the most important because at this point, the House flipped control in 2018 in the midterms, in President Trump's first midterms. So Democrats took back control of the House for the first time in 8 years. And as it stands now, it's very unlikely that Republicans can take it back, and also that Democrats might even be able to add seats, which even a few months ago looked unlikely. And so the Senate is currently in Republican control, and it's very much in danger of flipping because Republicans are defending almost double the number of seats that Democrats are, 23 Republican seats to 12 for Democrats. And of course, a third of the Senate is up each year. They're 6-year terms. And these senators that are up right now, they fall into either states that are becoming more difficult for Republicans, such as Colorado and Maine, and ones that were once more solidly Republican, but they're trending away from them, such as Georgia or Arizona. And so it's very much, at this point, we see it at the Cook Political Report as maybe a 50-50, but I think tilting toward Democrats at this point. And it's very important for Republicans, and we're seeing a lot of money flow into keeping the Senate, because at this point, when we look at where the polls are in the presidential race, President Trump is the underdog. We see it as a lean Biden contest. And if Republicans aren't able to take back the House, then the Senate is sort of their last firewall to prevent a Democratic trifecta that would enable a President Biden, a Biden administration to push through policies that Republicans don't want.
All right, so actually, let's step back for a moment. Tom, let me ask you, where we currently have something called divided government, where one party has the White House and one of the two houses of Congress, and the other party has the other house of Congress. Some people are fans of divided government. Some people are critics of it. What are the benefits and the downsides of having this this divided system which we currently have?
Well, the benefits would be, I think, people in the political center, more moderate voters who perhaps are not as ideologically devoted to one party or the other as the most ardent supporters. They have the benefit of legislation coming through the Senate and through the House being more complicated to get passage in a way that would necessarily, under the current system, attract votes from the other party in the situations of the most expansive or important legislative ideas that would be promoted by President Trump as the chief executive. The costs, however, would be, again, those people who wish for bolder, more aggressive action, whether that be some of the domestic spending priorities of the Democratic Party or the Trump White House, for example, in trying to overhaul the American healthcare system. They are complicated in those efforts because there is a situation in which the votes from the other side are simply not there. They don't command the majority in Congress to get that through. And it's a striking contrast with the situation in, for example, the British Parliament, where the Prime Minister commands a majority and should be able to pass through the House of Commons any legislation he or she wishes. That is not the case in the American system. It's certainly not the case at the moment.
Jessica, generally, do Americans like divided government, or do they like single party rule of both the executive and the legislature?
Well, we have seen typically, 10, 20 years ago that voters would split their tickets, that they were sort of seeing this as a check and balance, really. And you had parties that were making that argument. For instance, in 1996, when it very much looked like President Bill Clinton was going to be reelected, you had Senate Republicans with the blessing of the then nominee and former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole sort of making this argument, don't give them the Senate, we need to sort of be a check. But now as we see a decline in ticket splitting, you do have more voters that want sort of more broad power. But I think that sort of speaks to the polarization that we have in the country, that those voters in the middle, they may like more, divided government and sort of a check, but that middle is very much decreasing rather. And so that you have the party bases on each side that want ultimate control, that want to be able to pass whatever through, and they don't sort of like that this, Republicans are very upset over, the Democratic House that blocks things, and conversely, Democrats that took back the House, things die now in the Republican-controlled Senate.
Tom, are you seeing Republican Senate candidates sticking closely to the president, or trying to put a little distance between themselves and the president?
What's quite interesting, I think, is these candidates trying to sort of Cory Gardner in Colorado, for example, trying to play up elements that the consensus of the Republican Party is behind, whether that be sort of tax reform, for example, but then play down their links with the president in other areas where the president's, whether it be his rhetoric or certain policies that are seen to be uncomfortable with the independent voters who are needed to swing elections in their favor. And I think the broader challenge there is that President Trump's most ardent supporters, who are, a reliable constituent or need to be a reliable constituency for Republican Senate candidates, expect significant loyalty towards the president in terms of what these Senate candidates are saying out on the trail. And if they sense too much separation, they see that as disloyalty and prospectively a reason not to come out and vote. So there's this sort of catch-22, or this situation where candidates are caught between these two competing forces of needing to appeal to independents, but needing to consolidate their position with President Trump's most reliable voters. And so, it's a real challenge for them.
So, Jessica, if you could give advice to our viewers just on 2 or 3 Senate races that they should watch to get a sense of where the political winds are blowing here in the United States, what would you recommend?
Well, Tom mentioned Colorado, and I think Cory Gardner is in the most danger. That's a state that President Trump lost by 5 points, and we typically see that in competitive races. I mentioned the ticket splitting decreases, that outperforming the president or the party's nominee by 2 or 3 points is sort of the max that you can do. Arizona as well, Martha McSally is an appointed senator there. She just lost a race in 2018 for the same position, was appointed to the seat. This is the late Senator John McCain's seat. She is far behind her Democratic challenger, Mark Kelly, who is an astronaut and also the husband of Gabrielle Giffords, who was an Arizona congresswoman that was nearly assassinated in 2011. So I think those two are in the Democratic column probably, but then, so the net that the Democrats need is 3, but I really think of it as 4, because the most endangered incumbent is actually a Republican, or a Democrat rather. In Alabama, Doug Jones won the special election, and he's very unlikely to keep that seat. A very odd confluence of events and a controversial candidate enabled him. So if Democrats lose Alabama, then they need 4. So I think they get there with Colorado and Arizona, and then they need 2 more at least. And the 2 most likely that I would watch are Maine and North Carolina. These are sort of the tipping point states. Tom talked about the pull that these candidates have between Trump and trying to be more independent. No one has sort of been stuck in a harder place than Susan Collins.
All right, when we come back after the break, Tom, I'm going to ask you whether we can tell from how the 2 parties are spending money between the congressional, Senate, and presidential races, what we can learn from them about their priorities and where they think a few extra dollars might go a long way to victory in just a moment. We're starting a new segment on Dakhel Washington called Rob Recommends. My suggestion for a book, a film, a magazine, a website, something that will help you understand better how Washington and America really works. My first recommendation is what I read every morning, even before I walk outside to get my old-fashioned paper edition of the Washington Post. It's an online newsletter called Politico Playbook. If you want to know what DC insiders read to know the day's agenda, start here. You won't regret it. Our guests again today include Tom Rogan. Tom is an American with a British accent. He roams the world and the corridors of Washington as a political columnist for the Washington Examiner and as host of the McLaughlin Group on American Public Television. Also with us is Jessica Taylor. Jessica is a reporter for the Cook Political Report, where she focuses on the Senate and governor's races around the country. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio, Inside Election, and The Hill. She's also a contributing author to the 2020 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. So Tom, help us follow the money a bit. If you can look at what the Republican and Democratic parties and how they're spending, where do you think their priorities are? And do you think a little bit of extra money is going to help one of them over the top?
Well, Jessica and the Cook Report are the experts on this, but one of the interesting things I think we're seeing in this final run-up to the election is the degree to which big donors, most notably, I think, for the Democratic Party, Michael Bloomberg, who has pledged to put in up to $100 million to support Joe Biden, and Sheldon Adelson for the Republican Party, who is promising tens of millions of dollars spending more. That both sides sense that they need to double down, that there's a lot still to play for. In terms of specifics, I found it quite interesting recently that the Biden campaign has been putting money into Florida, increasing their allotments there, especially with advertisements designed to attract Hispanic voters who polling suggests may have moved closer to Donald Trump over the last 4 years than Democrats would have expected or certainly would wish. And in Florida, that really matters because the polls there are very tight in the presidential race. And so any voter that is up for grabs per se needs to be grabbed. And so both campaigns, I think, really will be spending a lot of money and time on Florida in the coming weeks.
So, Jessica, again, can you just give our viewers a little bit of context about our parties in the sense of Republican and Democratic parties? Are they like dues-paying, card-carrying institutions? Are they like, how many card-carrying Democrats and Republicans are there in America? What percentage of Americans actually affiliate with one or the other of the two main parties?
Well, we have seen sort of a spike in some Democratic registrations, but a lot of states don't require people to register by party, so it's really hard to tell at this point. But what we do have is in the Senate committees, at least, you have the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the Democratic Senatorial Committee. Candidates or members have to pay dues to that, and they then in turn use that money that they fundraise to run ads. And then, of course, we've had the Citizens United decision that came down right before 2010 that has opened this sort of flood to outside money. And that is what is just overwhelming here. So there are two main super PACs on each side, and they're each allied with the Democratic and Republican Senate leaders. Senate Leadership Fund is allied with Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, and Senate Majority PAC with Chuck Schumer, who is aiming to be the Senate Majority Leader, currently the Senate Minority Leader. And so they are able to spend just millions of dollars in outside ads to do this. And we see this pouring in. That is the majority of the spending that we are seeing at this point from both of those outside groups and the party committees. Republicans are almost entirely playing defense, as I mentioned. Really, Alabama and then possibly Michigan are their only offensive targets, but they are spending about 98% of their money defending their members, whereas Democrats, it's about 97% on offense. And so just that money itself is staggering. And again, it's focused in states like North Carolina, Maine. I do think there gets a point where, the ads are just diminishing returns because voters have been seeing these for so much. And, you can't go there and turn on a television, without seeing multiple ads. It's almost all you see during, primetime television or something, or online ads, of course, increasing with, places like Hulu. And so just the money is just become outsized. But what I have seen over the past month is the Republican committees, the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the Senate Leadership Fund, have had their best fundraising months. And I think that is an indication by Republican donors that they believe that the White House is possibly lost at this point, and they want to save the Senate for Republicans, again, as that last firewall. And so I think that is one of the most important stories that we are seeing here right now. Will Republican money sort of be able to do that? But, there's just tens of millions of dollars that have been spent already in these states. And, as we come into the last weeks here of the campaign, and really voters are already voting. Mail-in ballots have already gone out in North Carolina. Parties have had to sort of change their strategies too, because with the pandemic, of course, more people are going to vote absentee or mail-in ballots. And we've seen that we expect those to be more Democratic voters, whereas Republican voters, following the president's, really false claims about the safety of mail-in ballots, we expect them to vote on election day. And so that could, sort of cause, we're expecting sort of a delay in knowing some of these close races, really.
So, who is surging across the country? Republicans, Democrats, or is it pretty much a mixed bag?
Well, I think it's pretty much a mixed bag, but there is a marginal advantage to Democrats because of the decline in President Trump's approval ratings and the way that reflects on the Republican Party per se, more than with some politicians or presidents, because President Trump is such a force of personality and is seen to define the Republican Party by many voters. And so as Democrats try and present a narrative of healthcare reform at state and local levels, which quite frankly, they have a political advantage on in large part, there is an opportunity for them there. The counter side, though, which you do see Republican prospective gains on, is the idea of security, providing greater policing, because there is concern across the country in light of recent protests and some rioting as to whether the country is, or certain cities and states are secure enough. And so I think that will be a narrative as we approach November that Republicans really try to double down on.
All right, I'm afraid that we've run out of time. This is a fascinating topic, the politics of across the country, especially at local and state levels. Hopefully we can come back to this before the election, but I want to thank you, Jessica Taylor and Tom Rogan, for joining us today on Dachel Washington. Today's show focuses on all the other elections that are happening in November. Elections for Congress and the Senate, elections for governor and state level officers, even elections for county, city, and local officials. When you add them all up, there are thousands of elections about to happen, with tens of thousands of candidates. That in and of itself is a hugely positive sign of the health of our democracy. While many Americans may be frustrated that our population of 330 million produces the deep partisanship that we have and the two presidential candidates that we have on the ballot, it is heartening to see so many people of all ages, backgrounds, races, religions, and political outlooks throwing their hats into the political ring and offering themselves for public service, from school boards to Congress. Of course, if you live in Cairo, Baghdad, or Muscat, there's no reason for you to focus on all these local elections. But I urge you to keep at least one eye on what goes on in states, cities, and communities across the country. First, this is where our future leaders come from. Donald Trump is an outlier, a politician who never before served in public office. Look at all of our other recent presidents. Barack Obama served 3 terms as an obscure Illinois state senator before being elected to the American Senate and then to the White House. George W. Bush ran and lost a race for a seat in Congress years before he was elected governor of Texas and then president. And Bill Clinton was just 29 years old when he was elected Attorney General of the small, largely rural state of Arkansas. Then he became governor and ultimately president. Keeping an eye on local politics may give you an advantage in identifying which one of the many attractive young politicians on the ballot will emerge from the pack to become a national leader. Secondly, following local elections gives you a glimpse of the future of our two parties. Control of governorships and state houses is a harbinger of political power on a national level. State houses have the power of districting. That's the process of mapping congressional districts that has huge implications for who controls Congress. And states are the incubators of new ideas, test tubes for political and policy experiments in everything from healthcare to education to policing and a long list of other issues before they get applied nationally. So if you're a politics junkie and really want to chart long-term trends in America, keep an eye on who might emerge as a presidential candidate a decade or two from now. Go beyond the presidential vote today and look toward our states, cities, and local communities. Current politics may be in Washington, but the future is out there in America. Behava nasalu nehayat hadahil halka min barnamij Dachel Washington. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول أهم الانتخابات في الولايات في مختلف أنحاء البلد، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.